Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to be here. I'm Adam Elwan from ECHA's Communications Unit, and I'll be guiding you through today's session. Now, whether you're joining us from industry, government, or civil society, this webinar is designed to give you the clarity and tools you need to engage with the restriction proposal for certain chromium-6 substances. So, before we dive into the presentations, here's what you can expect. First, we'll help you understand why this restriction proposal matters, so what risks it aims to address, and how it fits into the broader REACH framework. You'll also get a clear picture of the scientific and regulatory reasoning behind the proposal, including how substances were selected, what data was used, and how impacts were assessed. We'll also be walking you through how you can contribute to the consultation, so what kind of input is most useful, how to submit it, and what happens to your comments. This session is designed to be both informative and practical, so you'll leave with not just knowledge, but also the tools to engage meaningfully in the consultation. You're welcome to send in your questions at any time during the event. Just head over to slido.com and enter the event code CRVI2025, or you can just scan the QR code on this slide. We'll be answering questions live until 4 Helsinki time. Please keep your questions within the scope of today's topic. If you have something outside that scope, feel free to reach out via our contact form at echa.europa.eu/contact. And don't worry, if we don't get to your question during the session, you'll find the answer in the Q&A document we'll publish shortly after the event. Now you can already find the presentation slides on our website, and the video recording will be available right after we wrap up. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be responding to all the questions we receive. Those we managed to cover live during the Q&A, and the rest will be included in the Q&A document. So, here's the program. After my short introduction, Morgane from our Risk Management Unit will walk us through the REACH restriction process. She'll explain how restrictions are used to protect health and the environment from chemical risks, the structure and content of an Annex 15 dossier, and how the risk assessment and socio-economic analysis committees evaluate proposals. She'll also be outlining the decision-making process at the EU level and the current state of play for this restriction proposal. After Morgane, Wijne, an economist here at ECHA, will present the restriction proposal in brief. Wijne will cover the background and scope of the proposal, including the substances and sectors affected. He'll also cover the rationale for the proposed use categories and the methodology used to assess worker and general population exposure. He'll also explain the risk management options that were considered, the estimated costs and benefits, and the proportionality and uncertainty analyses that support the proposal. Jukka, also from our Risk Management Unit, will then take the floor to talk about how you can participate in the consultation. He will guide you through what kind of information is most useful to submit, how to use the web form, and the timeline for the consultation. He'll also explain how your comments will be handled and how they contribute to the final decision-making process. I'll then conclude with the key takeaways from today's presentations. The webinar Q&A will remain open until 4 Helsinki time, during which our experts continue to reply to your questions. Now it's time to start the first presentation on the REACH restriction process. Over to you, Morgane.
Hello, my name is Morgane Thierry-Mig, and I work in the REACH Management Unit at ECHA. I will walk you through the REACH restriction process and how it works in general. First of all, I will give you an overview of the goals and main features of this regulatory measure. Then I will tell you about the content of a restriction proposal, how it is handled by ECHA, and how and why it is evaluated by the committees. I will also tell you what happens next. And finally, I will show you the timeline. So first, a risk restriction aims at protecting the health and environment from chemical risks. This happens when a risk is identified that is not adequately controlled and where action is required at the level of the European Union and not only at national level. A REACH restriction can take the form of a ban or a limitation of the manufacture, the placing on the market, and/or the use of a substance or group of substances, including when the substances are found in mixtures or articles. A REACH restriction can set out specific conditions, for example, technical measures, exposure limits, or labeling requirements. It is therefore a regulatory measure that can be specifically designed to address the identified risks. A REACH restriction can be proposed by a member state, a group of member states. It can also, like this one we are presenting to you today, be proposed by ECHA at the request of the Commission. Now you know a bit more about the main principles of a REACH restriction. Next, I will tell you about the content of the restriction dossier. A restriction proposal is made by preparing what we call an Annex 15 dossier. The name comes from the Annex 15 of the REACH regulation, which sets out what this dossier must include. It includes, in particular, information hazards, exposure, and risks, a justification that action is needed at the level of the European Union, and also available information on alternative substances or technologies. It may also include a socio-economic impact analysis. All these pieces of information are compiled in a report and justify the restriction proposal. The proposal indicates which substances are targeted and the proposed conditions of the restriction. In a nutshell, the dossier must demonstrate that the proposed restriction is the most appropriate regulatory risk management measure to address the identified risks. The decision maker will consider the Annex 15 dossier as well as the committee's opinions in their final decision. I will talk about the committees a bit later. On this scheme, which is available on ECHA website, you can see on the left side the steps taken by the dossier submitter to prepare the dossier. I will focus now on the two phases described in the middle section of the scheme. There are two main processes which run in parallel. First, there are third parties consultations, which allow all interested parties to submit comments on the restriction proposal. There is a 6-month consultation, which starts today, and I won't tell you more about it yet because my colleague, Jukka Peltola, will give you all the details later during the webinar. And then there is also a consultation on the draft opinion of the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee, which lasts 60 days and will happen toward the end of the process. The second very important process is what we call the opinion development. This step includes the writing of the opinions of the two committees and of the advice of the Enforcement Forum. And then the last phase on the right-hand side of the scheme is the decision-making and follow-up. I would like now to focus on the opinion development. As I mentioned earlier, the decision maker will take into account the Annex 15 dossier and the opinions of the committees. But who are these committees? First of all, they are composed of independent experts from member states. There are two committees, the RAC, which is the Risk Assessment Committee, and which focuses on hazards, exposure, risks, and risk reduction, and the SEAC, which is the Socio-Economic Analysis Committee, and which deals with the analysis of alternatives and the socio-economic impacts. There are several criteria for evaluating a restriction proposal, which are listed in the Annex 15 of REACH: effectiveness, practicality, and monitorability. When evaluating the effectiveness, RAC will evaluate if the restriction proposal is targeted to the effects or exposure resulting in the risk, and if it is able to reduce the risk within a reasonable time period. SEAC will evaluate if the restriction is proportionate to the risk. SEAC will also evaluate the socio-economic impacts, including the net benefits for the human health and the environment, and the net costs for manufacturers, importers, and consumers. So now I told you about the committees and what they look at in the restriction dossier. And how do they report the evaluation and their conclusions? Well, they need a bit of time to do so because the restriction proposal contains a lot of details. Both committees will take into account also the outcome of the 6-month consultation. RAC will spend 9 months scrutinizing the dossier and writing an opinion so as to conclude if the suggested restriction is appropriate in reducing the risk. SEAC will spend 12 months to conclude about the socio-economic impacts of the suggested restriction. These 12 months include a 60 days consultation on the SEAC opinion. In practice, there are rapporteurs in both committees and they will prepare the drafts of the opinions. Then, these draft opinions are discussed with all members of the committees to agree on the content. The opinions therefore reflect the views of the committees on the restriction proposal. Here is what comes next, the decision-making. After RAC and SEAC opinions are adopted, they are sent to the European Commission and published on ECHA website. Then the decision is taken by the European Commission together with the Member States, and that happens in a committee, the REACH committee. Next, it is scrutinized by the EU Council and the European Parliament. And finally, the restriction is adopted. So I presented to you the general steps of the process, what the committees will do, and how the decision is made. All of this apply to any restriction. I would like now to focus a bit more specifically on this restriction proposal on certain chromium-6 substances. Here are the state of play and the next steps. On 11th of April, the restriction proposal was submitted to ECHA. On the 29th of April, it was made available on ECHA website. On 18th of June, today, after the committees have agreed last week that the dossier is in conformity and that the opinion development can start, the 6-month consultation is launched. And for the next 12 months in total, the committees will evaluate the restriction proposal, as explained before. Toward the end of this evaluation, RAC will adopt its opinion and there will be a consultation on the SEAC draft opinion. Then SEAC will also adopt its opinion. And finally, both committees will have adopted their opinion, and this is expected to happen about mid-2026. And the last step is the sending of the opinions to the European Commission. If you would like to know more details about the REACH restriction process and the committees, you can take a look at the ECHA website where you can find more information. I hope that this presentation of the restriction process and step was useful to you. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you a good day.
Good morning. My name is Dr. Väinö Nurmi. I'm an economist working at the European Chemical Agency, and I'm here representing the dossier submitter. I'm going to give you a presentation on the Annex 15 restriction proposal for certain hexavalent chromium compounds. First, we start with the background. Background is related to the mandate that EU Commission mandated ECHA to develop an Annex 15 proposal for certain for chromium trioxide and chromium acids in September 2023. However, in April 2024, based on our initial investigation, Commission amended the mandate to include all hexavalent chromium substances on Annex 14 except lead chromates, and also include barium chromate, which was identified to have potential for regrettable substitution. Then in April 2025, ECHA submitted the Annex 15 report, and now in June 2025, the opinion making will start in the risk assessment and the socioeconomic impact assessment committees, and then also the public consultation will start. Then we move on to the scope of the restriction proposal. So the substances in scope. So the proposal will address identified risk by banning uses of certain hexavalent chromium substances unless they fall within a closed list of 6 use categories. We will shortly cover the 6 use categories. And they also comply with specific limit values for both worker exposure and emissions to the environment. And here below, you can see the list of substances, starting from the ones that were already in the initial mandate, chromium trioxides and acid generated from chromium trioxide and the oligomers, and then the additional substances that are also on the Annex 14 list. And as the last entry, you can see also the barium chromate there. Then we move on to the uses that are not banned with the condition that they comply with the proposed scientific limit values on both worker and environmental exposure. And these 6 uses are on the right hand side: formulation of mixtures, electroplating on plastic substrate, electroplating on metal substrate, use of primers and other slurry coatings, then 5 other surface treatments, and 6 uses as functional additive or process aid. And this is the closed list of uses. And which sectors this will affect, that's on the left hand side. So various sectors are affected and included in this list of uses. So aerospace and defense, in particular related to use category 4, then other transportation, general engineering, sanitary and other household appliances, packaging, steel, and so forth. So the scope of the restriction proposal in terms of sectors and uses is quite broad. Then we move to the approach to restriction proposal. Okay, so we start with the substances, uses, and hazards. So grouping of authorized uses. So how did we come up with this list of 6 uses? So this was based on substitutability considerations and availability of alternatives that provide similar functional properties to these hexavalent chromium substances that we just went through, but it's not based on judgment on the technical economic feasibility. So basically, the similarity of the use and the processes and what type of alternatives might be available for different types of uses. Then we also needed to limit the granularity of the use categories. So we needed to keep the assessment manageable, both in terms of having advantages for the data collection. For example, when we collected data from both from the AFAS and the call for evidences, we wanted to have good sample sizes to be able to have statistical analysis. And if we would have split the use categories into 50 different uses, of course the sample size would go very low. But also we were thinking of the enforceability and how easy it will be to identify the right use for the enforcer in later stages. What hazards we were most focusing? Well, human health hazards, because on the focus on carcinogenic properties, which we believe if those are properly controlled, this will mitigate also other health endpoints as well. Environmental hazards are not within the mandate, but the hazard assessment includes the hazards to humans via environment. Then the data availability. So in terms of data, this restriction is a bit of a unique situation because ECHA has received hundreds of applications for authorization for hexavalent chromium substances. We also have, in theory, for all the downstream users, we have downstream user notifications where they have submitted certain type of data. And then we have the registration dossiers also available for all the substances. So the challenge here is to integrate data sets of varying quality and varying time frames when they were submitted. So we might have outdated information. We might also have contradicting information. And then if we just couple all the data sets together, we have a serious risk of double or even triple counting. At the start of the process, we made a gap analysis. So to identify the gaps in the data, and immediately noticed that whilst we have plenty of information, we had some gaps both in emissions and exposures, not particularly in quantity but in the quality. Then, as I already explained, the 6 uses will have to comply with different limit values both for the worker exposure and environmental exposure, but we had no idea based on our initial data how the companies would respond to these different limit values. So we also needed to probe out the industry responses to different limit values. Then what is missing from the office is the abatement potential, so how low exposure is achievable for the companies and also how much it would cost. And to some extent, realistic substitution potential, and would substitution be a key response from the industry for different limit values, and what would be the cost of substitution if the company would substitute. So to address these data gaps, 2 calls for evidence were organized by ECHA, and here on the left-hand side you can see how different uses were represented in the call for evidence. So in total, 675 companies provided company-specific info on exposures, emission, what are their existing risk management measures, what would be their best response to different limit values, both for the worker and for the environmental side. Then what would be their abatement cost should they have to reach a different limit values, and what would be the substitution cost if their best response would be to substitute for in case of a certain limit value. In total, the sector is covered really well from this call for evidence. So responses from around 1/3 of the companies using hexavalent chromium compound substances in the EU was received. The best representative sample is from the electroplating on metal substrate, so nearly 400 responses. That's also because it's the use category with the most users in the EU, but also plenty of responses, for example, from the formulation side, then on the electroplating on plastic substrates, and so on. In the first call for evidence, we didn't receive that many responses from the use categories 4 and 5, so slurry coating and specialty surface treatments, and those were specially targeted in the call for evidence 2, and after that we believe that we also have a representative data of those companies. It should also be mentioned that most of the responses were from small and medium-sized companies, so also they were able to respond to these calls for evidence very well. Then how did we evaluate the exposure and risk in this dossier? So as I mentioned, we have 2 sides of the coin here. We have the workers that are exposed whilst doing their work, and then we have the general population, that is the population that is living in the vicinity of the sites that are using these compounds. Okay, on the worker side, we did the use category specific exposure assessment based on the call for evidence data. And as I mentioned, we also have a lot of other data. So we did check that this exposure assessment that was based on the call for evidence made sense, and used that by triangulating with the authorization for applications for authorization data, and then the downstream use and notification data. We did this so that we identified the high exposure tasks for each use category, and then generated combined exposure scenarios per site based on these exposure tasks. And we ended up with exposure distributions per use category which were also then corrected for frequency and use of personal protective equipment. Then on the general population side, again, call for evidence data was used, where we received companies' declared releases, both to air and water. These releases were converted to exposure using ECHA's standard modeling. And then we also wanted to see where this exposure takes place in the EU. So we explored the spatial distribution of hexavalent chromium emitting sites in the EU and wanted to determine the average population exposed per emitting site. So once we have all these tools available, so we have the exposure and we have the exposed population, we arrive at a certain risk. So we were able to derive the excess lifetime risk using the hexavalent chromium dose response relationships that has been used also extensively by RAC in the applications for authorization. We don't have to go this slide through in detail. So this shows the worker exposure approach. So as separate rows here, you have in the first column the high exposure tasks, and then as specific columns here you have all the 6 use categories. And as you can see, there's quite a difference between the use categories, which ones are the most relevant exposure relevant tasks. So if we take, for example, the use category 3, there the tasks that most contribute to exposure are loading and unloading of jigs, then surface treatment by dipping and immersion, then concentration adjustment of baths with liquids or solids, frequent maintenance activities, infrequent maintenance activities, waste and wastewater management, and sampling and transfer to smaller containers. And once we combine all these tasks, correct for frequency, duration, and PPE, we arrive at a certain worker exposure for the 8-hour working day. Okay, so let's move to the results of the worker exposure. So as I mentioned, based on this analysis, we were able to derive these cumulative worker exposures distributions, and here you have all the 6 use categories depicted, and as you can see on the x-axis here you have the exposure, and then on the y-axis you have the percentage of companies below a certain exposure. So if you take here for example the use category 4 and you move along the x-axis to 1 microgram of exposure, you can see that around 75% are below that exposure and 25% are having a higher exposure than that of the companies. And that's the one with the highest exposure in our data. The next one is use category 3, and there you can see that already below 1 microgram exposure are something like 90% of the companies, and most of the other use categories have even lower exposure than that. So we were able to see the differences in the exposure in different use categories. So we combined company-specific information for main data, applied frequency corrections, corrected for the use of RPE, and then, as I mentioned, we obtained the cumulative distribution functions that display this exposure. And the next step from here, from the exposure to risk, we need to convert the exposure to excess lifetime risk by using RAC dose response functions for hexavalent chromium. And here you can see results of that. So here the exposure levels have been converted to exposure risk, to excess risk. And this is also done for all the use categories, as I mentioned. And here you can see the statistics. So you have the number of sites that were part of this analysis. So they had sufficient data to make this analysis. You have the minimum and maximum risk between different sites in the EU. Then you have the median and 90th percentile risk levels. Okay, so once we had derived the worker exposure and worker risk, we can move to the general population exposure, and here is the approach that we use for that. So to assess the exposure around sites using hexavalent chromium substances, we use the information from call for evidence to estimate distributions for emissions. Then we used modeling, so the EUSS model, to convert emissions into cancer. And then we used downstream user notification and specifically the location information to gauge the population at risk. So we mapped all the hexavalent chromium using sites in the EU and checked what is the population around these sites. And by that way we were able to combine the individual excess risk around the sites to population risk and to calculate the excess cancer cases associated with the hexavalent chromium emissions. You can see a thematic figure of this on the right hand side. So here you have the emitting site. It's emitting on the upper part, it's emitting to air, and the lower part, it's emitting to water. And as a result, you have a certain exposure, so which is depicted, for example, on the upper part in the cloud. Then you use the RAC dose response relationship to convert that exposure to excess risk, and then you estimate the number of population that is exposed, and you derive the number of excess cancer cases. On the lower part, it's pretty much the same picture for the wastewater, except there the exposure and then the risk is dependent on how the company is treating their wastewater. So there we had 3 different scenarios based on the company responses. And again here the final results for that. So you have the on the left hand side you have the inhalation risk, and on the right hand side you have the oral route risk, so that's for small intestinal cancer. And as you can see, we again had a pretty good sample sizes for different use categories, and you have here the minimum risk, which is obviously 0, so some sites are emitting very, very low figures. And then you have the maximum risks, and those can be quite high for certain sites. That's already visible here. Then you have the median exposure, and then you have the 19th percentile excess lifetime risk. And they tend to go already quite low. So if you compare the maximum and then the median, there can be 4 orders of magnitude difference between that. So you have some very high emitting sites in the EU based on this analysis. So what is the risk management approach and restriction options? So as I have already mentioned, it's based on the scientific limit values, both for the worker exposure and for the environmental exposure. For the worker exposure, we have analyzed 5 different limit values, and these are all expressed in micrograms of hexavalent chromium in cubic meter, and then the 8-hour time-weighted average exposure. And these limit values are 5, 1, 0.5, 0.1, and 0.01. And for the environmental limit values, we have 3 different limit values, both for the air exposure and then the water exposure. And these are equivalent to risk levels of 1 to the power of -4, 1 to the power of -5, and 1 to the power of -6. And if you paid attention on the previous slide to the exposure levels, you can already see that achieving, for example, 1 to the power of -6 requires some measures from the companies, since even the median and often the 90th percentile values are above that one. If you take the 1 to the power of -5, all the 90th percentile values are below that, so not most of the companies need to do something, and so forth. We didn't specify which risk management measures the companies would need to use to meet the limit values or the environmental limit values, but want to acknowledge also the hierarchy of control which needs to be obeyed. So these restriction options, which were developed in the dossier, are based on these limit values. So by selecting different limit values for different use categories and different environmental limit values, one can develop restriction options. So we estimated the cost and benefits for each combination of use category and different limit values for worker exposure and different limit values for the environmental exposure. Then we used the call for evidence data, but as I said, it covered like 1/3 of the sector, so we extrapolated that to capture the impacts for the EU, and we assessed 3 restriction options in detail, which I'll show in the next slide. Okay, so here's 3 restriction options that we assessed in detail in the dossier. So restriction option 1, restriction option 2, and restriction option 3. And they are here as separate columns in the table. And then in the different rows, you have the different use categories, starting for the use category 1 formulation of mixtures and going down from there. And we have here 3 different restriction options. The RO1, so the first one is the most lenient one. So there, all the other use categories have exposure limit for the workers of 5 microgram, which is the same as the current binding occupational exposure limit value in the EU. But for use categories 2 and 6, we have exposure limit value of 1 microgram. For the ELV to air and water, for all the restriction options, they are always uniform across different use categories. For RO1, we have 2.5 kilos of hexavalent chromium per year to air, and 15 kilos of hexavalent chromium releases allowed to water. And those correspond to the risk level of 1 to the power of -4. Then the restriction option 2, that's the already much stricter than restriction option 1. So there we have a worker exposure limit value for most of the use categories of 0.5 micrograms of hexavalent chromium in cubic meter, except for use categories 1 and 3, where the exposure limit value is 1. And for air and water, for all the use categories, we have exposure limit values of 0.25 kilos for air and 1.5 kilos to water. And those correspond to risk values to 1 to the power of -5. And then the most strict assessed restriction option here is restriction option 3. And there, for all the other uses, we have a limit value of 0.1 microgram of hexavalent chromium in cubic meter, except for, again, use categories 1 and 3, where the limit value is 0.5. And then the ELVs for air and water correspond here to a risk level of 1 to the power of -6. Then we can move to the impact assessment part. So let's first stress out that the analytical starting point here is the point where the authorization obligations no longer apply to hexavalent chromium substances that are in scope of this restriction. But so we kind of start from the moment when these substances are removed from the Annex 14 list. So we are not here comparing the advantages and disadvantages of authorization against restriction. We are comparing the benefits and cost of restriction in case the substances are no longer on the authorization list. And this is due to the mandate and how we were mandated to do the analysis. It should be stressed out that the BOEL and IED still do apply. So we assess the impacts associated with ELVs for air and water for each use category. Then we mapped out industry responses to various limit values. So as I said, we have 5 different limit values that we analyzed, but we don't know how companies would react to those. Would they, if for example they would need to comply with limit value of 0.5, would they further invest into further risk management measures? Would they substitute? Would they close or relocate their business? And how this is dependent on the use category that they are operating in. Based on these responses, we assess the associated impacts. It should be stressed out that based on the analysis, there's limited substitution of hexavalent chromium substances expected because the substances offer a wide range of functionalities, ability to cope with different sizes and shapes and substrates. The technical readiness and implementation cost of various alternatives is quite high. Then there's always the possibility to import objects that have been treated with hexavalent chromium substances. So we always face that competition. And these current uses for hexavalent chromium substances have developed over decades. So there's industrial maturity value chains have developed, integrated, and become efficient. So in the impact assessment, we quantified certain costs and benefits. So starting from the left-hand side here on the slide, on the quantified cost, we quantified the compliance cost. So if the company stated that they would invest into further risk management measures to comply with the specific limit value, there will obviously be subject to abatement cost, so they would need to do some investment. And this abatement cost for workers was derived from the call for evidence. It was specifically asked from the companies for different limit values. For the environmental limit values, these abatement costs were derived from an existing restriction dossier where consultants worked on deriving the cost estimates for various technical solutions, and that was for a cobalt salt restriction dossier. And the reason why that was used is that the measures for these two different compounds and how to mitigate the releases are very similar to each other. Then in the case the company indicated that they would have to close or relocate, there would be non-use happening in the EU. And we also estimated the close or relocation cost or the substitution recertification cost in the case the company said that they intend to substitute. And as a result of these non-use scenarios, there will be also welfare costs like unemployment and profit loss, and they were also estimated and quantified. Then on the right-hand side, you see the quantified benefits. So we were able to quantify the health benefits for workers, health benefit for general public, and this was done by starting from the statistical cases that were avoided. I already explained how those were derived, but they were monetized using the willingness to pay values for cancer risk. Then, of course, there are also other impacts that would result in case of these restriction options, and they were qualitatively assessed. So we picked the most relevant impact categories from better regulation guidelines. For example, impacts on small and medium-sized companies, carbon footprint, risk of alternatives, and so forth. Okay, so moving on. So as I said, the impacts are very much dependent on what companies would do in case of different limit values. So if all companies already comply with the given limit values, of course, there's hardly any impacts. But if most of the companies would either close down or substitute, there would be much bigger impacts. So starting from the 5 microgram limit value, which is something that the companies now would need to actually already comply with. You can see that around 90% of the companies already last year when this was done complied with that one. And then when we move to stricter limit values, for example, 1 microgram per cubic meter, you can see that around 70% of the companies comply with this limit value. This is already quite significant and means that if this limit value is imposed, 30% of the companies would need to do something. And out of those 30%, 22% said that they would invest in additional risk management measures, so limiting the risk. 6% indicated that they would have to close down or relocate their business, and only 3% of the companies said that they would find a substitute in case of that limit value. Okay, and then when we go to stricter and stricter limit values, you can see that the compliance rate naturally goes down. And then the non-use, which is indicated by the yellow bar, goes up. At 0.01 microgram per cubic meter exposure level or limit value, already almost 60% of the companies in the EU would have to close down or relocate their business. Some 13% would said that they would substitute, and still around 20% of the companies would say that they could find such risk management measures that go below this limit value. Basically, it would be total closure, closed systems for performing the hexavalent chromium related tasks. So there's perfect segregation between workers and then the exposure. As I said, in case the companies would abate, they would have to pay a price for that, so they would have to invest in additional risk management measures. And these abatement costs were derived based on the company's estimated cost in the call for evidence, so to comply with different limit values. And here on the left-hand side, you can see a figure that shows how the abatement costs are dependent on the desired limit value. So the graph shows that as you go further and further in terms of strictness of the limit values to the right-hand side on the x-axis, the higher and higher the marginal abatement cost goes. And what is meant by marginal abatement cost, this shows you how much does it cost for the company to abate 1 microgram of exposure of hexavalent chromium compounds in the air. And there's quite a difference in the different use categories. So the use category 3, which is the plating on metal substrates, is significantly higher than, for example, many of the other use categories. And if you take as a counter example the use category 6, you can see that it's much cheaper for the companies to comply with different limit values. All the other use categories fall between these two extremes, except it should be noted that for use category 3 and 4, this is much dependent whether the companies think that they could use RPE or PPE to comply with these different limit values. And as you can see from this picture, in the optimal world, if some use categories, it's much easier to comply with different limit values, they cannot have exactly the same optimal limit value that would be enforced on them in the restriction proposal. And this is one of the benefits of the restriction dossier, that we are able to analyze and propose different limit values for different use categories. Okay, so that was for the abatement cost, and those would only take place if the company decides that their best response to different limit values is to abate. But if the company relocates or closes or substitutes, there will be other types of cost. So in case of closure, there will be producer surplus loss, and there we followed the standard SEAC approach. So we estimate the producer surplus by the profit losses of the companies. So if a company needs to close or relocate, the capital that is now used to generate profit, producer surplus for the EU, is no longer used. So some producer surplus is not is lost in the EU, and that is best estimated by looking how much that capital produces profit for the associated companies, and how long that capital would have been able to generate profit, and how long it takes for that to again start generating profit depends how quickly the capital finds other productive uses within the union. And that is dependent on how severe the shock the restriction is for the sector. So for RO1 and RO2, we only took into account 2 years of profit losses, and for RO3 we took into account 4 years of profit losses. Since it's much stricter, many companies would have to close down. There would be a lot of excess capital that hasn't found home yet. Then in case of closure, there would be also cost of unemployment. And there we also followed the standard SEAC approach. So we used the base average annual salary of an EU industrial worker and a multiplier of 2.7 to capture all the impacts of what unemployment has on a person. Then on a case of substitution, we took into account the one-time cost of substitution estimated based on evidence from the call for evidence and possible increase in operational cost, however their evidence is weak. We also took into account qualitative impacts for all the different restriction options. There, 0 means that there's little impacts to be expected. Minus means there's some negative impacts. 2 minuses means there's severe negative impacts. 1 plus means there's mild positive impacts, and 2 pluses means that there's significant positive impacts. Maybe here we could take one example out. So for example, if you go to restriction option 3 and look at the last row there, resilience, technical sovereignty, the open strategic autonomy and security of supply. In case of restriction option 3, very big share of the companies now operating in the EU would have to close down if they cannot. They have said that that's their optimal response, so they would shut down. And that also covers many critical uses such as use categories 3, 4, and 5. So very big industrial complexes, but also uses related to aviation and repairing of aircraft and so forth. So a lot of critical uses would either disappear in the EU, or at least would be much harder to do, since many of the companies now doing those would have to close down. So there is a bit of risk that many critical uses, and a lot of critical know-how could be lost in the case of RO3. These are all analyzed in depth in the restriction proposal and described in depth. Then we go to the quantitative analysis of the proportionality assessment. The proposal has two different restriction entries, which reflect the conditions of RO1 and RO2. Here, the dossier submitter doesn't have a preferred option. It depends on the policy consideration, and the RO3 is not within that proposal. And here you can see the proportionality assessment. So in different columns you have the different restriction options. Then on the different rows you have starting from upper part you have the total monetized benefits. So the health benefits, then you have the total monetized cost, and these are all for the assessment period of 20 years. And for RO1, the benefits and costs are approximately the same, a little bit higher benefits than costs, and when you have, and then you have limited benefits but also limited cost, and that can be concluded to be a proportionate restriction option. Then moving to restriction option 2. You have already higher benefits here. So the benefits over the 20 years are higher than 1 billion euros. But of course, the cost to comply with this already must trigger limit values are much higher again. So above 3 billion euros for the 20 years. And this makes the net benefit look quite highly negative. Here we say that this still may be proportionate because this depends on how the decision maker weighs the health benefits to the costs. We also show in the sensitivity analysis of the restriction proposal that with different types of political preferences, you could also claim that this restriction option could be proportionate. But when we move to restriction option 3, you have a bit higher benefits than for restriction option 2, but already 4 times higher cost than restriction option 2. So while the benefits are 1.3 billion euros for the 20 years, the costs are already higher than 12 billion euros, making it the net benefit negative by more than 10 billion euros. So you have some extended benefits compared to RO2, but very high costs. And if we also look at the qualitatively assessed impacts, quite negative impacts there. And there we conclude that that is not a proportionate restriction option. Then finally, I would like to say that we also did an uncertainty analysis. So the figures that I now showed seem quite like deterministic figures, and that is not the case. So there's a lot of uncertainties in the analysis. So we proposed the proposal identified and categorized all the uncertainties that we could find and mapped them according to their influence on the proportionality conclusions. And we performed a Monte Carlo analysis to quantitatively test the robustness of the impact assessment in terms of net present value. And the quantitative uncertainty analysis made it clear that our results are quite robust to different assumptions that we made. So here on the left-hand side, you have the net present value of restriction option 1. And on the middle of the graph, you have the point of 0. And as you can see, the probability mass of different net present values is distributed quite evenly across around the point of 0, so a little bit more mass on the right-hand side, which means that it's a bit more likely that the net present value of that restriction option is positive. Then on the other hand, on the right-hand side, you have the net present value distribution for restriction option 2, And then on the furthest, on the right-hand side, on the x-axis, you have the point of zero. And as you can see, almost all the probability mass of the net present value lies on the negative side of that. So on a very high certainty, we can say that based on the standard cost-benefit analysis, the net benefit value of restriction option 2 is negative. And you can see and find a detailed analysis and different assumptions on the key parameters from the restriction dossier itself. Okay, I think I can wrap up here. So thank you. And here you can see our functional email, where you can send us feedback on the different things that come into your mind related to this dossier. And of course, any other remarks that you might have. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. My name is Jukka Peltola. I'm working as an economist at ECHA and have been working on some restriction cases over the last 10-12 years. Morgan started the presentation by discussing about the consultation process, and Väinö, as a dossier submitter representative, described the restriction proposal. I will now go on further and describe how to take part in the consultation, how to participate. And from our point of view, the most important thing is that if you have something what you consider relevant for the restriction proposal and opinion forming, please provide it to us in the consultation process. So what to submit and how to submit? We basically want that you consider, if you have any information you consider relevant, you divide it according to the proposal main sections, and then provide your input into those fields. For instance, if you have information about hazard, you provide that in the hazard section or hazard field. And if you have information about costs, then you provide that in the cost section. And besides these general information sections, we also have a couple of specific information requests provided by RAC and SEAC committees. If you have information concerning those, then there is a separate field for those sections. Please use those for that. Besides the information per se, we also invite that if you have supporting evidence backing up your comment, then please provide that, because that helps us to understand the comment better, and it is easy to take into account. The committees, RAC and SEAC, can better take it into account in their process. There is no need to submit any information you have already provided. So if you have taken part, for instance, in the call for evidence earlier for this restriction proposal, or if you have provided information as part of the authorization applications, then we already have that information. There is no need to resubmit that one. How to submit? So we have a web form in the ECHA, on the ECHA web page, and in the web form there is information part where there are these fields, what to use, which I earlier mentioned, and there is also a little information text and the aforementioned questions. Joint submissions, we invite those. So if you are like-minded people, companies, organizations, or even whole sector together, you can always put together a joint submission and submit a joint comment. That is welcome in a way also that we see that it's already pre-digested and it's easy for RAC and SEAC committees to use and utilize in their opinion forming. And in case you have confidential information, there is a separate confidential information section. Please use that. So then it is clear for us also that that was confidential and we know specific ways how to handle it. And then as a principle, early bird picks a seed. So earlier you can submit your comment, better it can be taken into account. It's earlier in the opinion forming process. It's useful in that way. And we have so-called 18th of September as a so-called early deadline. And it means that those are already kind of looked at, those comments received by that time, looked at during the opinion forming process and when the consultation still continues. Timeline for the consultation, as you see from the slide, it's very simple. So it starts 18th of June, and as I mentioned, there is an early deadline, 18th of September, where we looked at what we've got and provide that to the committees, and then it ends 18th of December. And when provide all comments received, the dossier submitter and the committees, they will be given all the comments then in the end of the process. And as a reminder, the earlier we got the comments, the better. Keep in mind, use most recent version of the Annex 15. That is important. You can find the most recent version in the same place on ECHA webpage as the consulting web form. SEAC and RAC will only consider the comments which have been provided via this official consulting system via web form and by the deadline in 18th of December. No other ways of sending of comments or late comments can be taken into account. And you can refer to the consultation guidance or information note which are shown on the slide. What happens to your comments then? So after submitting the comments, ECHA publishes them on its website, and RAC and SEAC and dossier submitter, they will look at the comments, they will assess them, they will take them into account if they appear useful and substantiated. And in the end, RAC and SEAC as well as the dossier submitter responds to the comments. And those responses are planned to be done in spring, summer 2026. In the end, the submission of comments, how to submit in practice. So when submitting, please remember a couple of technical points. So first of all, you cannot save your submission when you are preparing it. So it's maybe a good idea to sketch the submission on another platform somewhere else and copy it to the web form. So in that way you don't lose it in the midway if something happens. Please note that it's not possible to retrieve the comment. So if you have submitted it, that's there. And also, if you want to remember what you submitted, it's a good idea to take a screenshot or copy of your comment. So you then remember exactly what you submitted. And as a third thing, when you are ready, then push the submit button, and then ECHA will receive what you submitted, and ECHA will prepare and send you a receipt, or you will automatically get the receipt, and there is a submission number. So if in some stage you want to communicate about your submission with ECHA, use that submission number. This was all from me, and I want to thank you for following all the presentations. I hope that they were useful, and we hope that you can help us by providing relevant and useful information on the topics covered in the restriction proposal. Thank you very much.
We've come to the end of our webinar. Thank you to our presenters. Let's wrap up with a few key takeaways from today's session. So we've looked at why certain chromium-6 substances are being targeted, because of the serious risks they pose to human health. The proposal is designed to be focused and proportionate. It allows some uses to continue, but only under strict conditions to keep exposure as low as possible. Everything we've shown today is based on a thorough assessment of data, including input from hundreds of companies across the EU. Now it's your turn. The consultation is open, and your feedback really matters. It will help shape the final decision. As mentioned at the start, you can find the presentations already on our website, and the video recording will be available immediately once the broadcast ends. We will now close the broadcast, but the Q&A remains open until 4 Helsinki time. Keep sending us questions until then, and we will do our best to reply to as many as we can. We will reply to all the questions we received today in a Q&A soon after the event. Thank you for joining us today, and goodbye.